Photography is such a gigantic activity. There are so many different subgenres of photography, and many of them require different skill sets. Much like an illustrator couldn't organically create a banner ad because that's a graphic design skill set, it's very unlikely that just because someone can take a photo for a product, that they could also be trusted to shoot an entire wedding or vice versa. Right? They're different skill sets. And this is why you have specialists in the first place. You wouldn't go to a doctor for a problem with your teeth, and you wouldn't go to a physio for a problem with your mental health. Photography is just like that. The beautiful thing about it, though, is that rather than it being a completely different skill set, there are similarities between the different subgenres of photography in that they all involve taking photos. That means as photographers, we can explore every genre of photography with ease and determine which genres speak to us and which don't. This is something that I so very highly encourage because picking up one skill set in one genre of photography allows for carryover to other genres. And bringing skill sets along with you in this journey is immensely helpful for not only understanding photography as a whole, but also for allowing you to stand out in a very crowded field because most photographers just end up sticking to one or two genres of photography. Plus, there's always the thing that you don't know what you don't know. How could you possibly know and understand what it is that you like specifically without trying it in the first place? Try things. Experiment. If you like it, add it to your toolkit and to your skill set. And if you don't, then move on. The game is to gain a tremendous amount of skills along the way on your journey and then combine them all together to then show off your style. And I assure you, your combination of skills and what you've been influenced by will make you stand out if you decide to go down this route. Okay, the rest of the day is going to be spent introducing you to some of what I consider to be the key photographic genres, and then we're going to be spending the next few days doing an overview on some of those specific skills that you'll need to learn within the more popular genres. All right, let's start with the most famous genre in all of photography. You see a pretty vista, you take a photo. It's really as simple as that. I don't say that to dismiss the technical difficulty landscape photography can have, but I say it because at the end of the day, it's all about sharing nature. You know, landscape photography has been around since the very beginning, and the amount of draw and compulsion we have to it really speaks to our connection as humans to the world that we live in. Sometimes landscapes can be wide open vistas in nature, and you know the scenes. Huge mountains towering over everything, looking so big that no normal human would consider climbing them. But landscapes can also be far less grand than what you might consider to be photo worthy. You know, things like detail shots of smaller valleys, close-up images, or, you know, a simple scene at the edge of a lake. If it's in nature and it's a picture of the wonderful surrounds and it's a fairly wide vista, it's probably a landscape. Also, some people like to throw in the idea of urban landscape, also called a cityscape, into this genre as well, and I think I agree with that terminology. You know, a cityscape is an image that is usually something that showcases the skyline of a city, and it's not quite architecture and it's not quite nature, but it's still shot wide and it's still a scape, so to speak. Now, urban photography is a kind of whole archetype of photography that can really have most kinds of subgenres within it. So in that vein, categorically, I would agree that a cityscape is a landscape. But regardless of what genre of photography you end up doing, almost every photographer at some stage will capture some kind of landscape image. So it's probably a good idea to at least dip your toes into this genre at some point. Tomorrow, we'll be actually doing a much deeper dive into landscape photography as a whole, and I'll teach you some of the techniques and genre-specific things you need to know about it to really get sunk into it. Street photography, my first photography love. Street photography typically occurs in cities, on streets, in an urban setting, but despite what the name suggests, street photography doesn't literally mean that you're going to be literally photographing streets. I mean, You might be, but it's usually not associated with just that. Many people have many different interpretations and explanations about what street photography actually is, but my definition is simply that street photography is the documentation of the human condition. It's about showcasing what human life is all about, how we live, how we love, how we exist with one another, the things we do on a day-to-day basis, our hopes, our dreams, and everything in between. Most of the time, street photography involves some kind of human. After all, documenting the human condition is actually quite difficult to do effectively without a human in it, but it can also be about the environments that humans live in as well. Street photography can be shot wide, it can be shot in detail, it can be shot as a landscape orientation image, or it can be shot as a portrait orientation image. There really isn't a boundary when it comes to street photography other than that it kind of has to be about humans, in my opinion. And I think this is why it's just so wonderful. The interpretation of it is just so varied and so wide that it really allows a lot of creativity. It's also, in my opinion, one of the hardest genres to master in both craft and art, but it's also one of the most rewarding. And while not everyone will engage in street photography throughout their photography journey, in my opinion, learning street photography as a skill set is perhaps the most valuable skill set that you can learn from a technical perspective. For that reason, we'll be going a little bit more in depth with this one too in the days to come. Portraiture is another photographic genre about humans, except this time it is way more direct and way more literal. Now, portraits can vary wildly in size, shape, and style, but ultimately they will always feature an image of a person who will be the main subject of that image. And sometimes humans will be very large in that composition, or it might just be their face, like a headshot. Sometimes the human will be a little bit smaller in the composition, allowing for more of the environment to provide the story and the information about the setting. And this is called a contextual or an environmental portrait. But then sometimes you also get really simple portraits where it's just the model and that's it. And then sometimes you get these like really crazy and wild, shots with prisms and reflective light and fancy clothing and makeup and all this kind of fun stuff. Now, portraiture has quite the large skill set as well. And it's a skill set that involves a lot of practice outside of just using your camera too. Because ultimately you are working with other people in this genre of photography. So things like interpersonal skills are very much required in this skill set. Unlike being able to just go to a landscape location and then just take your shot and then leave, in portraiture, you have to learn things like direction, building rapport, posing, and a whole bunch of other different stuff. But not only that, there will be considerations in things like outfit, makeup, dress, and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to portraiture. And for this reason, we'll be going into more depth about portraiture in the days to come as well. Architecture is a style of photography that is all about the showcase of structures. From bridges to skyscrapers to tunnels and hallways, anything that has an interesting structure as the main focal point of the composition is probably an architecture shot. Architecture is usually shot very wide, even wider than landscapes, and it usually features a lot of geometry much of the time. So think of lines and pattern and repetition and perspective. It's not uncommon that an architecture will feature humans in it, but if it does, it's usually pretty easy to see if it is a street shot or an architecture shot just by how many lines and perspectives and geometry it has. Now, I wouldn't say that architecture is a super common genre of photography that people engage in. In fact, for the rest of the list of today's lesson, I would say they're all about similar in terms of how many people engage in it, in my opinion. Landscape, street, and portraiture are probably the most common. But architecture is definitely worth mentioning here because there is a lot of domain knowledge to learn when it comes to things like perspectives, and it can have a lot of carryover to other genres as well. It's definitely a genre of photography that I would encourage you to explore. Next up, we have weddings. And yep, it's all in the name. Wedding photography is all about the documentation of the celebration of people's most happiest day. Now, I'll say up front here that I have a massive respect for wedding photographers because this genre is hard. The skill set required for successfully and uniquely photographing weddings is absolutely gigantic, done at the highest level. In wedding photography, a photographer needs to know skills like how to take portraits, how to set up lighting, how to document ambience and mood and emotion. They need to know how to naturally bring out the best in the bridal party and so on and so forth. There is a tremendous amount of pressure as a wedding photographer as well. You really only have one chance to get it right. There's no redos, not to mention, the high stress situation of everyone involved in organizing the event and people's temperaments and all those kind of things. This type of photography is definitely something that has a lot of interpersonal skills integrated with it. And thus, it is something that also takes quite a while to learn and a lot of practice and patience to get good at. But you can also make a tremendous amount of money here as well. So that's the trade-off. Sports is a fun one. I honestly don't know too many photographers who do sports, but to those that I do know, they do love it and they are passionate about it. If you're interested in sports photography, chances are you're probably interested in the sport that you are trying to capture. And I'm told that loving the sport that you're documenting is pretty much the requirement so that you can understand the general flow of the game, where to shoot next, where the best moments occur, and all those kind of things. Sports photography will teach you a lot about shutter speed, people, and composition, and it can be quite difficult to stand out in the industry, much like in street photography, but much like any genre, there's plenty to learn and you'll definitely be rewarded by doing so. Not to mention that, there is actually quite a bit of money and quite a few careers to be found here in the sports photography industry. So it might be worth learning if sports and a particular sport is your passion. Photojournalism is using photography to tell a news story in some way. And sometimes that might be images of people, sometimes it might be images of an incident or something related. And the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And that's true because oftentimes photojournalistic images are absolutely spot on in terms of storytelling because the standard is so high. But oftentimes nowadays, irony be damned, a photojournalism article is often accompanied by a write-up as well. However, the combination of both provides the ability to tell such a dense story and such a rich story, and it's actually quite inspiring to see how high the standard of good photojournalists can be. They're often the jack of all trades when it comes to photography, and many people say that the traditional street photographer skill set overlaps nicely with photojournalism, but with more of a focus on ethics and the journalistic approach with the sole purpose of telling a compelling story. Event photography is another genre of photography that is also quite diverse and dynamic and requires a few different skill sets as well. Event photographers can see themselves using both wide and narrow focal lengths and flip-flopping between the two quite often, especially when thinking about things like capturing the stage, the artists, the crowds. Some event photography is shot in low light as well, and capturing people in low light can be very tricky sometimes. The skill set of the event photographer is definitely pretty well rounded in this respect, so it's a great genre to start learning some skills in, especially if you like the gigs that you're shooting. Wildlife photography is a game of patience, often armed with very long telephoto lenses like 200mm and up. A lot of wildlife photography requires hiking, trekking, and being patient at locations in order to be able to spot the wildlife that you're trying to capture. Typically, you use much longer lenses here because obviously you can't get really close to the animals to capture them, so a longer telephoto lens usually works best here. Now just be aware that at the upper level, the more expensive level, the lenses that are typically used in wildlife can be quite expensive. Perhaps the most expensive out of any genre of photography, to be honest. And I'm sure you've seen those memes or images of those photographers with gigantic lenses that are the size of my arm. These lenses are usually 400mm f2.8 lenses, and they'll usually set you back a minimum of $10,000 each. That being said, you can definitely get a lesser quality 400mm equivalent for much cheaper than that, but it is just something to consider if you want to get into this genre. In terms of skill, aside from the soft skills outside of photography that are required here, like hiking and trekking, the wildlife skill set is a lot about mastering focus and timing. In terms of composition, it can be either as varied or as fixed as you want it to be, but it does have a lot of skills to do outside of photography specifically. Location scouting, animal identification, weather prediction, being out in nature, on the hike, all of that kind of stuff. Macro photography is about getting super close and personal with your subjects. This is one of those genres of photography where the gear really matters. You can't get super close to your subjects without a very specific, dedicated macro lens. We've covered this already when we initially talked about lenses, but if you're interested in getting into this genre of photography, then expect to have a very dedicated macro lens as your minimum entry point. At some stages, you might even expect to have many different macro lenses. Also, while lighting plays a huge role in all of photography across any genre, lighting in macro photography is a little bit more specialized because in most cases, you won't be using natural light. Instead, most macro photography is done with a continuous light setup. Maybe it's a softbox, or maybe it's a product dome or something like that. This means you also have to learn how to set up lighting in a studio setting, which I do recommend that all photographers learn at some point anyway. It's not that hard. However, all that being said, once you get going and your setup is good, you'll find an entirely new world that comes up when it comes to the close and personal. Macro photography always surprises me with how different things look super up close, and the abstract nature of that genre really appeals to me as well. I always say that photography that allows you to provide a perspective that isn't a normal human everyday perspective is going to be interesting, and macro photography definitely is that. Product photography is a genre that I find myself increasingly more interested in over the years. While products vary in shape and size, the basics of product photography are similar. In product photography, you'll find that you need skills in set design, studio lighting, placement, color theory in order to really excel at this genre of photography. And that's because from a technical photography perspective, the shot itself is actually quite straightforward. Have a depth of field that shows off enough of the product properly, set it on a tripod, expose it correctly, and that's kind of it. The rest of it is really about designing the context around it in an appealing way, using props and using color and making sure the light is right and positioning the product in the right ways and showing off the right features. And once you have the externals and the setup correct, the shot comes all on its own. And that's not to say that product photography is easy. The setup, depending on how complex it is and what kind of product it is, can be very difficult to get right. Also, there are some products that require shooting outdoors and using natural light as well. In these cases, things like a portrait photography skill set come in super handy, especially when shooting things like clothes, for example. From runways to streetwear, detail to full body, fashion photography is very much like portrait photography in skill set, in that it's very much about the model, the outfit, and the context. Except in fashion photography, it's obviously far more focused on the clothes themselves rather than the model wearing them. That being said, both are still very important, and there needs to be lots of consideration in the model's shape and size relative to the outfit, because at the end of the day, the models are the ones showcasing the fit. There also needs to be an extreme attention to detail about the clothing itself. Paying attention to things like how the folds of fabric sway around, how it flows, how it shapes the body, the colors being used, and generally a lot of the thought behind the connection between the model and the outfit. I've also heard that fashion photographers at the very top level make an absolute killing when it comes to careers as well. So if you want a career with longevity, there's always that. Still life photography is an interesting one. Still life as a genre in general in all of art is an interesting one, just, as a whole. It's the same principles though, images of inanimate objects, usually something that is quite mundane or boring, but composed in a way to evoke some kind of emotion or thought. Still life can really be about anything or any subject, so long as it's an inanimate one. And in many ways, things like food photography or product photography also classify as still life technically. However, the difference here is really one about intention. Still life aims to take the mundane and craft it in an artful way, and the focus is on the art. Now, how you decide to do that is completely up to you. In terms of skill set, still life photography is very similar to product photography. You can also use natural or studio light, and there's a lot of skill that revolves around things like placement and context and the setup rather than the actual technicalities of the shot itself. A good thing about still life in this way is that it's very chill. It's very laid back. You can take your time in the comfort of your own home, and that really allows you to experiment quite a lot, and with that you can get really creative very quickly. Travel photography, in my definition, isn't necessarily a genre of photography in and of itself. It's more of an amalgamation of genres or an archetype with the deliberate aim of inspiring the viewer to travel to that destination and showcasing what that place has to offer. This is the genre of photography that I personally engage in, and it's one where, for the most part, I'm doing it in the genres of portrait, landscape, and street photography in order to document the people, places, and cultures that I'm looking to find. For me, travel photography can be any genre of photography in any style, so long as what you're doing is providing the viewer with an escape to a destination for a brief moment. Sure, you can also document your adventures as you go along as well. That's totally valid too. But I see a lot of the travel photography industry as photographers looking to showcase what a country and a culture has to offer. All right, that was a lot. Now, of course, there are a lot more photography genres that people engage in. So I am so sorry if I didn't get to cover one that you may want to get in. But I did want to mention at the end here that ultimately, it doesn't really help to think of genres as very hard boundaries. There is always gray area, and there are always skills within the genres of photography that will have carry over to the next. In fact, you'll find that as you continue to learn more and more genres of photography, that the more genres you learn, the progressively easier they become to learn over time. And that is specifically because of that carryover. And the game here is that you want to expose yourself to as many genres and as many skills as possible so that you can start to get a good gauge for how photography works across its entirety. After that long journey, then it's a great idea to then start niching down into what you like. All right, assignment time. Today's one is easy and conceptual. I want you to list out 5 genres of photography you could potentially see yourself doing, and then put them in priority order, ready for you to tackle after you finish this course. Yes, that means you'll be thinking about which genres you want to learn and in what order. It is a very simple and very easy task, but having a vision on your future development is something that I'm all about, as you've probably already figured by now. Otherwise, if it's too easy for you, then take it as a rest day because it was too easy. No problems. Enjoy. I'll see you tomorrow.